Welcome to my channel. My name's Bissy, and if you enjoy my longer videos where I dive deeper into character analysis and the themes, then you're going to love this one. Now, this is part 2 of a mini-series that I'm doing where we get to meet the characters that we're going to get to know in season 3. So in part 1, we got to know Gabriella, as she'll be known in the show. And if you haven't watched that already, please do check it out. I found it interesting getting to know Gabriella, and I think you will too. But today, I think it's important that we discuss Lestat and Nicolas's relationship ahead of season 3 of the Vampire Lestat. And I've broken down and summarised every stage of their complicated, young, emotional, and some might say doomed relationship, all from the novel. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what will be included or changed in the show. And for me, that's the exciting part. So for anyone who hasn't read the book but would like to know more about their relationship, and for those who have read the book but would like a little bit of a refresher, I think you'll enjoy this one. And if you do, please let me know by hitting like and subscribing to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. And with that said, let's get into the video. The Wolf Killer and the Cloak. Now, in the novel The Vampire Lestat, with the help of his beloved dogs, Lestat killed a pack of wolves who had terrorized their land in the winter of his 21st year. Lestat is the youngest son of a marquis, making him French aristocracy. The wolf pack is vicious, and the ordeal certainly had a lasting effect on him. The story of the great Lestat, the wolf killer, reaches far and wide. The story becomes legend. Lestat becomes a legend. Nicolas de l'Enfant and his father visit Lestat's castle on behalf of a grateful village. Nicolas and his father are wealthy, but not nobility, a fact that Nicolas's father resents. Nicolas is apparently the spokesperson for the town, as he is the one who hands Lestat the red, wolf fur-lined cloak on behalf of a grateful village. In this meeting, Nicky and Lestat find that they're attracted to each other, and Lestat being Lestat can see that Nicky is troubled, but he's attracted to that. Bonding through conversation. Nicky and Lestat form a bond over both being impossible, or should I say being thought of as impossible by their families. In part 1, chapter 4, we learn that Nicolas took lessons from Mozart. However, this brought disgrace to Nicolas's father. Now, as I alluded to earlier, Nicky's family were something of social climbers. Now, that's not to say that they were unique in that aspect in that time. Many of the wealthy were. He believed that Nicky had shamed his very expensive education by turning away from said education to follow music. However, Lestat loved Nicky for doing exactly what he wanted to do. Gabrielle encouraged Lestat to befriend Nicky. Now, I'm going to call her Gabrielle in this video because I'm speaking about the books. But for the show, I'll refer to her as Gabriella, as they have changed her name for the show. And I hope this doesn't get too confusing. So Gabrielle encouraged Lestat to befriend Nicky, knowing that his brothers would hate it, and Nicky's father would absolutely love it, Lestat being the son of a marquis and all. But following their initial meeting, it took Lestat a week to go and meet him again. They eventually went for a private supper where they could speak and be alone, and of course, Nicky paid. As although Lestat was nobility, his family were extremely cash poor. The pair admired each other. Their back and forth was immediately so natural, with Nicky asking, "What was it like to kill the wolves?" and Lestat jumping straight into, "What was it like in Paris? Did you go to the theatres?" Nicky was a cynical young man and didn't hold back on telling Lestat the truth of Paris. The stench, the thieves, but all Lestat wanted to know was what the theatres were like. They spoke like this for 4 hours in that private room. Nicky says, "It all sounds a hell of a lot better in this room than it actually is." He goes on to say that no one values anything anymore. Everything is a fashion. Even atheism is a fashion. Nicky was not only cynical, he was sarcastic too, but he remembers Lestat from their childhood. Nicky recounts a story where Lestat was crying or screaming over some so-called witches that had been burnt alive. But despite everything Lestat hears from Nicolas, he still romanticizes Paris. And it is in this conversation that the seed of their move to Paris is sown. Nicky kisses Lestat that night, and Lestat opens up about how he's been feeling, the loneliness in his heart. Lestat asks Nicky to play his violin for him, and despite his cynicism, Nicky reacts as any other lovesick person would do. He runs home and gets his violin so he can play for Lestat. Upon Nicky's return, he plays for Lestat the most beautiful tune. Lestat couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never heard music like it. the rawness, the way Nicky leaned his whole self into it. Their time together was emotional, like nothing Lestat had ever experienced up until that point. He had fallen for Nicky, not for his light, no, not even for his looks or his money, and importantly, not in spite of Nicky's darkness. He fell for him almost because of it. Lestat was drunk and in tears by the end of it, and Nicky walked him home. The next day, Lestat stopped by Nicky's father's shop and threw stones at the window to get Nicky's attention. He and Nicky spent that day together, and after that day, whenever he wasn't hunting, he was with Nicky. They spoke about everything, right up until the moment where they reached what they called their golden moment. The moment where everything made sense. Nicky says, "We're partners in sin. It's what binds us." Ever cynical. Lestat continues to talk about the actors and the theatres of Paris. Acting could heal the sick, he says. Lestat opens up to Nicky about his time with the Italian acting troupe, and it is with that troupe that he discovered his love for acting. He also lost his virginity on that trip and was dragged home by his brothers and brutally beaten. I go into this story in detail in my The Story of Lestat's Mother video. If you haven't checked it out, please do. I think you'll like it. So for anybody who hasn't read the book, I think now is an important time for me to mention that the books are actually written in the first person. Lestat is speaking to us, the readers. And it's at this point that Lestat explained to us, the readers, that he was prone to overwhelming attacks of emotion. However, Nicky, despite his cynicism, could always calm Lestat, if not with his words, then with playing the violin. Nicky would say, "Lestat, believe me, this will pass." However, Lestat will explain to us, the reader, that it never did truly pass. And yet, despite the well of darkness inside of Lestat, he still had an opposing and seemingly bottomless well of optimism. But you could make music like that. At least we had these beautiful things. Such goodness. The move to Paris. I mentioned Lestat's time with the Italian acting troupe briefly in the last section. However, Lestat had actually left home on 2 occasions before his move to Paris. His time at the monastery as a very young man, and his short stint with the acting troupe. Running away to Paris was his final attempt to escape his father and his brothers, and Gabrielle, his mother, had given him the funds for him and Nicky to move to Paris. I mentioned that Lestat was prone to what he called emotional episodes. And it's during this last episode, his deepest yet, where Gabrielle hands him a hanky full of gold coins. She said to him, "You rage against this like you rage against everything else." She goes on to say, "Death is spoiling life for you, that's all, but life is more important than death." Gabrielle is dying of consumption, and she admits to Lestat that she knows that he and Nicky are planning to leave. She doesn't want him to wait for her to die. She wants to die knowing that he is in Paris, living the life that he wants to live, with Nicky. She doesn't care what he does there, but he must go. She admits that she has been keeping him close, but she must let him go now. She tells him that Nicky's father also knows of their plans, so they must leave now. She instructs him to find a letter writer who can write in Italian, so no one will read them but her. This is important, as Lestat was not taught to read or write. He learned some of the basics at the monastery, but he could not read or write a letter at this time. Gabriella is from Naples, and Italian is her first language. She receives letters from her family back in Italy often, so this way they can communicate safely. Lestat grabs Nicky at the bonfire and tells him, "We will leave tomorrow." They have no real plan. The important thing is just to get there. And Lestat is inexpressibly happy when he writes to Gabrielle for the first time 2 weeks into their stay. Lelio rising in competition. In chapter 8, we learn that it was in fact Nicolas who gave Lestat his love for the opera. He even gave him some of his fine clothes to wear so that they could attend together. They were finally free. Free of their families, free of their expectations, free of the positions, and free to walk hand in hand in Paris. However, it did not take long for Nicky to fall back into his familiar, unhappy thought patterns. Whilst he was back at home, he could pretend that one day he could become this great violin player. He could annoy the voices in his head, shouting that he was too old to make it as a great player. Nicky didn't regret leaving for Paris, but he did begin to resent Lestat. He believed that everything came easy to Lestat. He says, If you had set out to play violin, you'd be playing for the court by now. And with Lestat's seemingly unending optimism and fascination with the goodness of this dark world, Nicky became sick of Lestat's malady of morality. Nicky says, "I love you, but in a real way you're a fool, with all your ideas of goodness." Lestat responds, "Nicolas, I do not believe I can go on if I do not believe in goodness. Instead of mocking me, why don't you tell me what you believe in?" Lestat and Nicky at this point had found and joined a theatre, Renault's The House of Thespians, with Lestat acting and Nicky playing violin. It is also at this point that Magnus begins to stalk Lestat. He saw Lestat on the street as he and Nicky were having this conversation. Nicky is broken and apologizes to Lestat. "You have a light in you that is almost blinding, but in me there is only darkness. I try to keep the darkness from you because I need your light. I need it desperately, but you don't need the darkness." Forced apart by Magnus. Now, I did go into detail about Lestat's turn-in my Lestat Has Issues video, so if you haven't already, please do check that out. But very briefly, Magnus becomes obsessed with Lestat after seeing him on the stage and continues to stalk him. He's not subtle about it either. He takes Lestat from his room and keeps him in his tower. Magnus turns Lestat against his will and then abandons him by throwing himself into a fire. Before he does this, he provides Lestat with some very, very basic instructions on how to survive and what to do with his ashes once he's done. He also shows him his new inheritance as Magnus's only fledgling. Now, I'm currently working on Magnus's history, and this will hopefully be the next video in this series. And don't worry, I am still working in the background on Marius's history, well, his time in Rome, and it's just taken a lot longer than I thought it would, so please, thank you so much for bearing with me. So Lestat is alone, isolated in this tower. He's no longer human, he has no mentor, he has no friends, and he doesn't know exactly what he is now. Not until a very faint memory of a word resurfaces. Vampire. This is what he is now. The thirst that he feels is undeniable. Lestat had been gone for many nights, but he couldn't face Nicky as he was now. This thing, this monster. He resolved to stay away from Nicky and everybody that he loved. Lestat arranged for Pierre Rosier I, his new lawyer, to send money to Nicky via courier, who was to be told only that the wealth had come from his friend Lestat de Liancourt. It was Lestat de Liancourt's wish that Nicolas move at once to a decent flat on the Ile Saint-Louis or some other proper place. Rosier should of course assist in this, and thereafter Nicolas de l'Enfant should study the violin. Now, this was not okay with Nicky. He demanded to see Lestat. Gifts and short tales would not cut it. They had started this new life in Paris together. They loved each other, right? And to Nicolas, Lestat had just left him in the middle of the night and not come back, with no explanation. Nicky was beginning to frighten Rosier with his demands and his persistence. Rosier couldn't give Nicky any more than Lestat had instructed. Lestat didn't want to be tempted, and so he didn't even ask for Nicky's new address. But Lestat did hear that Nicky had remained at the theatre, the House of Thespians, and Nicky was still playing violin. And Lestat understood it. I mean, he loved it there as well. And he didn't want to leave. And Lestat stayed away for as long as he possibly could. But all he could think about was Nicky. Nicky wrote to Gabriella and told her that Lestat had bought the theatre. In part 2, chapter 11, we learn that by the March, Lestat couldn't stay away any longer. He asked for Nicky's address from Rosier and went to Nicky's flat. He watched him have dinner with some of the other players. And Nicky seemed to have zero problem spending this new wealth that Lestat had provided for him. He wore a jeweled ring I'd sent, and his brown hair was tied back in a black silk ribbon. And he sat brooding, with his elbows on the table, eating nothing from the expensive china plate before him. Carefully, I opened my eyes and looked at him again. All his natural gifts were there in a blaze of light. The delicate but strong limbs, large, sober brown eyes, and his mouth, and for all the irony and sarcasm that could come out of it, was childlike and ready to be kissed. There seemed in him a frailty that I'd never perceived or understood, yet he looked infinitely intelligent. My Nicky, full of tangled, compromising thoughts. Nicky sensed Lestat. He had recognised in my monstrous self something that he knew and loved. In part 2, chapter 12, Lestat finally gives in and goes to the theatre. He goes in through the back and is immediately seen by the troupe. They are so grateful to see him, their new benefactor, but he could only think about Nicky. And then Lestat sensed him. He was a foot away staring at me, but he was too glad to see me to be hurt. And when he came into my arms, I felt a convulsion of terror. But the light was dim here, and I had fed furiously to be warm and human looking. And then there was only Nicolas. I looked up into his face. We were closed off in this embrace. The hard heat of his body made me stiffen and draw back. Lestat contemplates taking Nicky and feeding on him then and there. The thirst was just too strong. In the embrace, he rests his lips on Nicky's neck, and he suddenly catches himself and pushes Nicky away. Lestat rushes off and somehow finds himself back on stage. And after a slow start, Lestat falls back into his familiar role as entertainer. However, on stage, Lestat loses himself and uses his cloak gift to touch the rafters. There was initial shock, but then he does it again, and the audience loves it. Nicky and the others are uneasy, as they can see that there are no wires. Some of the musicians even drop their instruments and leave the pit. It's during this time that Lestat notices an old man in the audience. Lestat roars and jumps at him, and the old man shoots Lestat, and Lestat flees. He later feeds on the old woman and a child. Innocence. Nicolas is turning and descent into madness. So by this time, Lestat has already turned Gabriella. They're in Paris and notice they're being followed. The Children of Darkness had taken Nicky. Armand, a sad being, was their leader. Nicolas was being held in a cage while the members of the coven danced around the huge fire that was beneath him. Armand screams, "Order shall be restored when he and the woman he made are destroyed before us all." Lestat removes Nicky from the cage, and in this interval I went forward, climbed the pyre and tore loose the front of the wooden cage. I dragged him free of the cage and brought him down to the dirt floor. He was feverish, and though I ignored and would have concealed it if I could, he shoved at me and cursed at me under his breath. And after Lestat had confronted the beliefs of the coven, and Lestat had driven most of them out, it remained just Lestat, Gabriella, Armand, Nicky, and the queen of the vampires, not Akasha. Armand angrily says to Lestat, "You, for whom the working of the dark trick is an act of shameless greed, you gave it to the very womb that bore you. Why not to this one, whom you worship from afar every night?" All this as Nicky's heart was beating dimly in the background. Lestat grabbed Nicolas and left, heading for the tower where Magnus had kept him. Gabrielle urged Lestat to ship Nicky away, to get him out of France, to please not turn him. Part 4, Chapter 4. Gabrielle's words rang so loudly in Lestat's mind. Do not do this thing. Lestat goes to Nicky in the tower. He is screaming and angry that Lestat had given the dark gift to Gabrielle, whilst he had given him only money. "How could you keep this from me?" he whispered. "Take your life and leave with it. When it was offered to me, I said no. With my last breath, I said no," Lestat said. But Lestat eventually relents and says, "Come to me, Nicky. If you want it, you must come." Lestat screamed as he drank from Nicolas. "Now, my love, now's the moment, and send you into the oblivion in which nothing can be understood or forgiven. Or I can bring you to me." His arm slipped around my neck, his face wet, eyes rolling up into his head. Then his tongue shot out. It licked hard at the gash I had made for him in my own throat. And finally, it was finished. The veil of silence had come down, as it had with her. Silence. He was separate. Now, having witnessed all of this, Gabrielle utters just one word: disaster. Immediately, Nicolas's demeanour was sour. He exhibited no frustration or horror at his new existence. Lestat had one thought: and the realization gnawing at his insides like an animal that I couldn't stand the sight of him now. The breakup. After a long and enlightening conversation with Armand in chapter 5, Lestat urges Gabriella to leave Paris, just the three of them, as Armand is just too dangerous. But we mustn't be hasty. The important thing now is for the three of us to remain together. And together we must try your plan to rouse Nikki with the violin. However, Lestat is repulsed by Nikki now. I found I could not watch him hunt or kill. Our silent accomplice, little more than a resuscitated corpse. Jeez. But they were a coven of three now, planning to leave Paris for Italy. But Nicolas had vanished when Lestat had been with Rosier I, making arrangements. Gabrielle says to Lestat, "Listen to me, there are only two things that go round and round in his mind. One of them is the pyre underneath Les Innocents, where he was almost burned, and the other is a small theatre, footlights, a stage." They headed straight to Renault's, the theatre, where they found Nicky sat in the pit in his old seat. Lestat retrieves Nicky's violin from his old dressing room and asks Nicky one last time to play for him, as he did on that very first night in that private supper room. Nicky looked at Lestat for the very first time since his turning. He took the instrument, he put it to his chin and began to play, until a raging torrent of melody suddenly flooded the hall. They are then joined by the remaining members of the old coven, and they dance to Nicky's intoxication music. And for the first time, Nicky laughed as the others surrounded him. Nicky fixed his eyes on Lestat and exclaimed, "I give you the Theatre de Vampire, the greatest spectacle of the boulevard." Lestat turns his back on the scene and walks to his old dressing room. Nicky followed and seemed to have passed into mania. Nicky had just founded the Theatre de Vampire, as we know it. "I want the theatre," Nicky said to me. "I want it from you. The deed, the money to reopen it." "You may have it if you wish," I answered. "It is yours if it will take you and your malice and your fractured reason off my hands." Nicolas looked at Lestat like he hated him, but Lestat didn't leave. And Nicolas explains that the entire trip to Paris was a failure. Nicky had in fact planned for the entire trip to fail, but instead Lestat had triumphed in Paris. Nicolas rants, "And the light, always the light, and in exact proportion to the light coming out of you, there was darkness in me. And then the magic. When you got the magic, irony of ironies, you protected me from it. And what did you do with it? Use your powers to simulate the actions of a good man?" Nicky continues to taunt Lestat, and Lestat smacks him, which hurls him across the room. Nicky gathers himself and says to Lestat, "I despise you, but I am done with you. In darkness, we are equal now." Lestat says his farewell and urges the others to follow Nicky. Outside, Gabrielle tries to comfort Lestat. "He's made his choice, my son. What's done is done, and you're free of him. Let him go, Lestat. They will care for him." But Lestat couldn't let him go. Not fully. Later, he hears that Nicky has threatened Rosier, so he confronts Nicolas one last time. Nicky is crazed, and Lestat finally hands ownership of the theatre to Eleni, along with its income. Armand's handiwork. In part 6, Lestat and Gabrielle have been travelling the world. Lestat finally received a large packet of letters. Within those letters, there was news of Nicky's treatment back in Paris. The writer of the letters, Eleni, describes Nicolas as their divine violinist. Lestat writes back and begs them to be patient with Nicolas. He wonders if his presence would improve things. He resumes his travels, and when he reaches Damascus, her reply is waiting for him. She says that she's doing her utmost to protect the child who should never have been born to darkness. She says he's overwhelmed by his powers, dazzled and maddened by his vision. Yet, he has written his greatest play this last month, where the sound of a young violinist's music raises vampires from their graves. Lestat responds with predictable concern, but he continues on his travels, masquerading as a gentleman. Together with Gabrielle, they set sail for Egypt, Upon their arrival in Cairo, there was a strange package waiting for them. He stared at it for an hour and asked Gabriella to leave so he can open it in private. He imagined he was back in the supper room with Nikki back in the Auvergne. Lestat opens the package and sees the case of Nicolas's Stradivarius violin. Lestat reads the letter that accompanies it, where he learns of the fate of Nicolas at the hands of Armand, who the writer refers to as our oldest friend. The letter reads, "It has come to the worst as I feared. Our oldest friend, maddened by the excesses of our violinist, finally imprisoned him in your old residence. And although the violin was given to him into his cell, his hands were taken away. But understand that with us, such appendages can always be restored. And the appendages in question were kept safe by our oldest friend, who allowed our wounded one no sustenance for 5 nights. But N, maddened by the pain and the starvation, slipped into unbreakable silence and remained so for a considerable length of time. At last, he came to us and spoke, only to tell us that in the manner of a mortal, he had put in order his business affairs. A stack of freshly written plays was asked to have, and we must call together for him, somewhere in the countryside. If we did not, then he would make the theatre his funeral pyre. Our oldest friend solemnly granted this wish, and you have never seen such a sabbat as this. But here, send this unto my maker." And he put his violin into my hands. And I think we were never more moved, never more in terror, and never more sad. He went into the flames. But understand, we did all that we could to prevent what occurred. And this news broke Lestat. However, fortunately, he was not alone for long. I merely gave her the letter so that we didn't have to talk. And she read it and put it away. And then she had her arm around me again, like she used to long ago. Lestat never fully recovers from the loss of Nicolas, and it takes show Lestat over a century to try again. He alludes to Nicolas throughout his relationship with Louis in the show. Even when show Claudia teases and mocks him about the piece of music he composed for Nicolas, Lestat can't help his vulnerability around the subject. He doesn't snap at her. Instead, he looks to Louis and simply says,
"It took me over a century to try again."
We all remember our first loves, so we can empathise with Lestat to that extent. We may have regrets about things we did or didn't do in that relationship, but hopefully we've learnt lessons that stood us in good stead for our future relationships. But what we can't know is how deep those feelings have the potential to cut so deep after centuries. Centuries of regret, centuries of loss, centuries of mistakes. Lestat is still haunted by Nicolas, and I cannot wait to hear from him directly in the show. Let me know what you're most excited to see in season 3. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe, as this will let me know that you're enjoying my videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next one. Thank you. Bye.